to have this gentleman on. He's an OG of all this. He's super well respected, an incredibly prolific author, and it's an honor to have him on Tinfoil Hat. I'm sad it's taken us this long, but we've made it happen, and we're very appreciative. Please welcome to Tinfoil Hat, Joseph P. Farrell. How are you, sir?
I'm fine. Thanks for having me on, guys. Pleasure to be here.
It's an honor, sir. We're very thankful to have you on. If you could, for those who may not be familiar with you, sir, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where our listeners can find you?
People can find me at my website, which is www.giza-star, that's all lowercase, one word, .com. As for me, I'm just a guy who writes weird books that people read, and that's about it. I've got about, I'd say maybe 41, 42 somewhere in there books out right now.
And where does your journey begin, sir? Where do you begin to get into all this stuff? Was there a moment where you go, okay, man, something isn't what we thought they're telling us, or well, where does your journey begin? The genesis of all this?
Well, it began when I was a kid. There are several streams that feed into, I can't put any one particular beginning. There's lots of beginnings, but one of the most significant was when I was a kid. My dad was an engineer, and they used to play cards every Friday night. They would play cards with another couple in my hometown. I grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And they played cards every Friday night with the chief engineer of the local CBS television affiliate station. And, you know, with two engineers playing cards, naturally the subject of discussion on many nights at the card table was engineering. And one night I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, I forget which. My father and this other engineer started discussing out of the clear blue sky. They started discussing the Great Pyramid. And, you know, I had no idea. To me, it was just a pile of rocks in Egypt, you know. But they were both going on and on about some of the wonderful engineering of it. And so that kind of lodged in my mind. And then the other thing that lodged in my mind, my parents would take trips all over the country when I was a kid. So, you know, I've been pretty much everywhere in the country. And one year we went up to North Dakota, and as we're traveling across North Dakota, I saw the big phased array radar that had been abandoned by President Nixon under the ABM treaty that he abandoned. But this phased array radar site had already been constructed, and it was a pyramid. You know, I thought, well, gee, that's kind of interesting that, you know, you have a phased array radar in that shape. So that, you know, that plugged into my thinking. And then the final thing is I'm just terribly unhappy with the academic model of ancient history. You know, we're supposed to be hunting and gathering for hundreds of thousands of years and not making any sort of progress. And then all of a sudden, we decide to quit hunting and gathering and domesticate animals and start civilization about, you know, 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, depending on who you're listening to. And that just never made sense to me. So it's been a lot of things that fed into it.
We on the show often discuss the hidden hand, the occult, and the you know, obviously hidden history. We discuss it a lot, and there's so many different things that we could get into with you. But I want to start off with the Civil War. We've had a lot of guests come on talking about Lincoln, good guy, bad guy, who's involved in it. What are your whole thoughts on the Civil War?
Well, I just completed a couple of books that have just come out. In fact, the second one in this little mini series of books came out about 3 weeks ago. The two books are The Rialto in Richmond, and the subtitle to that is The Money War Between the States. And then the second book in that series is called The Rialto in Richmond Reconstructed, Confederates, Canada, and Carpetbaggers. as far as the Civil War goes, I'm convinced that there's a lot of hidden history there, that you only have to look at some of the well-known and some of the lesser known events in the Civil War and start connecting dots, and you'll easily see that there's a lot of hidden hand there. Now, let me offset that by saying that I don't have any bone or saw to pick with either Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis, for that matter. Both men were caught up in the events of their times. They were both good men, I think, but certainly not perfect men. We know Lincoln's flaws, we know Jefferson Davis's flaws, but by and large, I think they were both good men that were caught up in a series of very bad events. That said, I think that there is a vast, huge hidden history to the Civil War that I try and document in those two books. A lot of it, a great deal of it having to do with finances, and then partly a lot of it having to do with geopolitics.
If you had to guess what was the biggest misconception about the Civil War, what would it be?
Well, I think there's a lot of misconceptions. We Americans have the misconception that it's all and about slavery and nothing else other than slavery. Well, that's certainly a factor in it for sure, but it's not the only factor. But the other, as far as I'm concerned, the far more dangerous implicit narratives that Americans have about the Civil War is that it's a war that more or less occurs in a geopolitical vacuum. In other words, it just affects us and nobody else. And it is the exact opposite. The American war between the states occurs in the context of a massive geopolitical transformation that is taking place in the world at that time. And you only need to look at the fact that Lord Palmerston, at the beginning of the war between the states, actually threatened to go to war with the Union and stationed British troops in Canada. And then, of course, the Emperor Napoleon III in France put in a puppet government in Mexico. So, in other words, the European Western powers were heavily involved in noticing the events. And then, of course, we have a very interesting phenomenon with President Grant at the end of his second term in office after the war. He goes on this worldwide tour circumnavigating the world. And by the way, he just happens to stop off in Berlin to have some tea and cigars with Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. And I'm sorry, guys, if you think the two are discussing the wonderful pictures of their grandchildren, that doesn't wash. But the problem is we don't know what they were discussing. So I have some guesses that I put in the book.
What would you say it was?
Well, I think partly it's finances because the Union. Most people are unaware the Union, by issuing Lincoln greenbacks, if essentially ruined its chances of getting European funding, to help finance the Union war effort. The Confederacy, on the other hand, was very able and capable of obtaining European funding for its war effort. So you've got a conflicting picture. The only European power that made any major investment in the Union was Prussia. And by the time Grant leaves office, Prussia has become the German Empire. So, with Bismarck still in charge. So that's number one. Number two, uh, Germany, most people don't realize this, but Germany, and we have to understand at the time of the Civil War, Germany is not the name of a country, it's a region on the map, okay? But I'm using the phrase Germany
Right.
just to indicate that this is where many of the officers and soldiers for the Union Army come from. If you look at the roster of Union officers during the Civil War, you'll find a lot of German names. Well, what happened was
Holy cow.
the 1848 revolution in Europe that was not a success was such a disappointment that many Germans came to this country after the failure of the 1848 revolution. And when the Civil War breaks out, they enlist in Lincoln's army. So Mr. Lincoln ends up with an army that is full of a bunch of Marxists. Okay. I
Holy
think
cow.
Thomas De Lorenzo wrote a book called Lincoln's Red Republicans, all about all of these German officers in the Union Army. I can think of one famous character by the name of Schimmelpfennig, but all of these officers in the Union Army that are basically Marxists. Okay. So Lincoln ends up with this very strange, strange army that he's in charge of. So that's number two. Number three, and this is where I think we really have to buckle down and understand that there was something going on in prior to, during, and after the Civil War with the airship mystery. My friend Walter Bosley has written an interesting book called Origins about the Black Project's world and airships that existed in this country prior to the Civil War and then after it. During the Civil War, what most people don't realize is that President Lincoln himself was, the Union president, was made aware of this airship technology, and he actually went to Congress and asked them to fund it, and they did. And his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, pardon my French here, folks, but Edwin Stanton is a real turd in the punch bowl during intermission at the opera. This guy is a character, okay? He gets his hands on this project, and we don't know what happened to it. I strongly suspect this becomes the first Black project for reasons I get into in the first Rialto book. But this shouldn't surprise us. Both the Union and the Confederacy used observation balloons, to report on enemy troop movements during the war. Now, the interesting thing about the airships is that prior to the Civil War, a German artist by the name of Charles Dellschau is painting these very bizarre, weird pictures of all of these airships. And he always abbreviates these pictures with an acronym called NYMZA, NYMZA. And he comes, incidentally, from Prussia. So I suspect that NYMZA, I mentioned this to Walter, and Walter published it in a book. I suspect that NYMZA is an English transliteration for Nationale Jagdflugzeugzahlungsamt, which is a big mouthful of German for the National Flying Machine Payment Office. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that there was a funding mechanism for all of these airships that American inventors are flying around that's coming from Germany and coming from Prussia. So I suspect that this may be the third thing that Ulysses Grant and Otto von Bismarck were talking about, was the airships. The reason I say that is there's a little clue that I put in the second book, The Rialto and Richmond Reconstructed. And all the clue is it's a picture. And it's a picture of, I want to say 4 or 5 Union officers, including Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren. There's another character for you Civil War aficionados. And it's a picture of these 4 officers in the Union. And right in the middle of the picture is Count von Zeppelin from Germany. Now, if you don't know who von Zeppelin is, he's the guy that invents dirigibles. Basically, you can credit the Hindenburg as being the last example of that technology. So we have this German count that is interested in airship technology over here during the Civil War, having his picture taken with a bunch of Union officers, one of whom was going to lead a raid on Richmond. So, I don't know what that means, other than you have a lot of very strange European interest in the Civil War. So yeah, you've got the beginnings of a military industrial complex there, and a lot of hidden history.
when we're talking airships, we're not talking like modern day planes. Are you
No,
talking like blimps and stuff like that?
no, we're not talking blimps either. This is where most people go astray with the 19th century airships. The airship that President Lincoln was funding and sponsoring was being designed by an American inventor by the name of Anderson, I believe was his name, Dr. Anderson, who test flew. There are witness reports and newspaper articles reporting the test flight of his airship. This thing flew at speeds over 200 miles an hour. So, in
Holy
other words,
cow!
this is not a dirigible. This is not a blimp. And the other thing about what he did, and again, this is the project President Lincoln was sponsoring. The other thing about this ship was it was capable of maneuvering in air. So in other words, it is not just a hot air balloon. It's capable of its own self-directed flight and very, very fast flight, especially for that time. We don't really know what they are. But if you look at going back to Dellschau, this German artist that's painting all of these things, if you look at some of his weird paintings, you'll quickly understand that you're not looking at any sort of conventional dirigible or hot air balloon or blimp technology.
Can I ask you about the timeline? How much longer after this was it that Zeppelin developed the Zeppelin, as it was?
Zeppelins, oh, the first ones I believe were developed commercially by him in the 1870s. So it was within a decade.
Yeah, so it
say
makes a
a
lot of sense,
decade,
right?
decade and a half. So
And
very, very quickly.
And there's a parallel on the southern side as well, right? With the Hunley and the submarines that they had. Those were a highly secret program. And if that government had lasted, it probably would have stayed secret, possibly.
Oh yeah, the interesting thing about that I point out in the first of the Rialto books is that uh, we have a completely false impression uh, that we learn about the Civil War from our history books. That is to say, those of us who were lucky enough to study the Civil War, like I was in school, Lord knows what they're telling them now, but or even if they are.
Unbelievable.
But the impression that was created in public narratives of Civil War history when I was a kid was that when Richmond fell and President Davis and his cabinet evacuated Richmond, that they were roaming around the Carolinas and President Davis was some sort of fanatic that was wanting to continue the fight. Okay.
Right.
That's the impression. Well,
Guerrilla warfare, right? That's what
yeah, guerrilla warfare.
He wanted that.
But if you know anything about Jefferson Davis,
Yeah.
This is about the farthest thing from his mind that you can imagine.
Yeah.
What I take great pains to talk about in the first of those books is that President Davis's flight from Richmond is not a desperation thing. What it is what we would now call a continuity of government operation.
Oh, snaps.
Because what Davis was doing was he was taking the entire Confederate federal cabinet with him, with the exception of his Secretary of the Treasury that broke off. And in addition to that, he was taking the specie reserves of the Richmond banks.
Gold, baby.
Gold and silver, and by the way, a considerable supply of English pound sterling notes, the reserve currency of the day. He was also taking with him the specie reserves of the Confederate Treasury. Notice those two different things: the reserves of the Richmond banks and the reserves of the Confederate Treasury. And here's the final kicker: he was taking with him all of the official departmental seals of the Confederate government. So, in other words, those seals means that this whole thing is a continuity of government operation. What he was trying to do was he was following a plan that had been elaborated, and this is another part of the war that many people forget about. He was following a plan whereby Lee would disengage the Army of Northern Virginia from the defenses of Richmond and link up with Davis, and then later link up with General Joseph Johnston down in the Carolinas and make their way to the Trans-Mississippi Department of the Confederacy. The Trans-Mississippi are the three states, Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, plus Oklahoma, the Indian Territories, that are west of the Mississippi River, and continue the war from there. Now, most people don't understand that the Trans-Mississippi Department of the Confederacy, after the fall of Vicksburg, was number one, it was the most productive part of the Confederacy. It was self-sufficient in food. It was capable of a small amount of its own manufacture of munitions, including heavy ordnance. And here's the kicker. That part of the Confederacy was the only part of the Confederacy that had an international border with a neutral, namely Mexico. So when you study the history of the Civil War, all that nonsense that we're taught, oh, the Union blockade crippled the Confederacy and cut them off. Well, no, the Union blockade was actually porous, and much of the material that was flowing back and forth between the Confederacy and Europe is doing so through the Caribbean, through the Gulf of Mexico, through Mexico, into the Trans-Mississippi Department, and then funneled across the Mississippi River, okay? So in other words, what Davis is trying to do is simply move the government from Richmond to the Trans-Mississippi. And the reason why he's trying to do that is he's trying to get surrender terms for the Confederacy that are better than simply, as he describes it in his memoirs after the war, are better terms than simply a surrender at the pleasure of the Union. That's what he's trying to do.
How realistic is that? Because they make it sound like in the books, and what I was taught is once Vicksburg fell, there was like an iron curtain fell over the Mississippi.
No, that's not true. Again, what they're asking you to believe is that, yeah, this is an iron curtain, and the Union has, stationed ships every 500 yards down the whole of the Mississippi River from Cairo, Illinois to New Orleans. Yeah. Well, that's absurd because the Union doesn't have enough to do that. So in other words, yeah, they're blockading the Mississippi River just as they're blockading the Confederate shoreline. But the Confederate shoreline is a lot longer than the Union shoreline, and that means the blockade is always going to be porous. Always, always, always. And this is the problem. And the other problem that they don't teach you in those history books is, yes, the Trans-Mississippi Department of the Confederacy was kind of a confederacy within the Confederacy. It was kind of a self-sufficient department. So I think it's very realistic. You had particularly with Joseph Johnston and the army that he was commanding at the end of the war, you had a much more substantial army than that Robert E. Lee ended up with after the 1864 Wilderness Campaign. So had those two armies linked up, would they have been able to fight or make their way to that department? Possibly. And the real problem that we have to remember is that General Grant and General Sherman both wrote in their memoirs that this would have been a disaster because the Union's efforts to try and invade the Trans-Mississippi they were failures, largely because it's very difficult to move the large field armies that you had in the Eastern theater of operations and make that happen in that department. There just wasn't the infrastructure to do it. So it was a very real threat that they were concerned about.
So when you get into all this stuff, it sounds like the Bank of England. Am I right? No? Am I wrong on that?
Ding, ding, ding. Off my hat. Yep.
Respect. Thank you. Is behind the South, and then Prussia, which becomes Germany, is backing the North. Why do you think the South eventually lost? If they had the Bank of England behind them, why and it sounds like they have all this territory to the west. Why does the South lose?
Well, for the standard reasons. They're outnumbered, they're outproduced, and they're outsupplied. But you have to remember something here, very, very significant. Number one, the Civil War does not occur in a vacuum. And we'll get back to that in a minute. It's not in a geopolitical isolation. Okay? And we'll get back to that. Number two, you have to remember that up until 1864, at the beginning of 1864, Jefferson Davis, under the Confederate Constitution, has 2 more years to serve in his 6-year-long term as president of the Confederacy. So he's not up for re-election. But in the Union, Abraham Lincoln is up for re-election that year. And at the beginning of 1864, his political chances are not looking too good. Why? Because in spite of Union victories like Vicksburg and Gettysburg, basically everything is still in a standstill. It's still a standoff. It's still a stalemate. He has not been able to translate those battlefield victories into a decisive and overwhelming victory against the Confederacy. Okay? So Lincoln at the beginning of the year is worrying that he might actually lose the upcoming election. And because of that, he decides to allow Grant, General Grant, to take the gloves off and basically fight a war of attrition and logistics. Okay. In other words, simply bleed the Confederate armies white. We can't really best them tactically on the battlefield. So what we're going to do is we're going to play to our strengths and not theirs. And, let's face it, the Confederate generals were very competent tacticians, all right? So you have 1864 beginning, and you have Grant's Wilderness Campaign that basically lasts that whole year. And as a result of that, he never wins a really clear or decisive victory in that entire campaign. But what he does manage to do is bleed Robert E. Lee's army of Northern Virginia white, so that, Lee's army ends up, by the time that he surrenders to Grant, of being maybe 8,000 or 9,000 men that are able to fight in an army that is at best 30,000 men strength. So that campaign bleeds the Confederacy white, but it was not a foregone conclusion at the beginning of 1864. But the other thing that Americans forget is that both France and Britain, as I mentioned when we started talking about this, Britain had stationed troops in Canada. Napoleon III had put a puppet government in the form of the Emperor Maximilian in Mexico and backed it up with French troops. They were ready to go, and they were ready to recognize the Union. And in fact, there was an incident at the beginning of the war involving a Union ship that had boarded and taken prisoner a British ship that was transmitting Confederate ambassadors to Great Britain, and imprisoned them. And of course, when that was done, the British absolutely hit the roof with outrage, because, that was the reason we went to war with Britain in the War of 1812. The British were boarding American ships at sea, neutral ships, and taking people off the ships and impressing them into service in Great Britain. Well, we did the same thing to the British. So when that happened, Lord Palmerston, as I mentioned, Lord Palmerston, at the time the British Prime Minister, Henry John Temple was his name, he basically gave an ultimatum to President Lincoln. You either release those Confederate commissioners right now and send them on their way to Great Britain along with any other of that crew of that ship, or it's war. And he had the regiments, sent off to Canada. And by the way, as the regiments are leaving Great Britain for Canada, the British military bands are playing Dixie. Okay, so that ought to tell you what was about to happen. And of course, Lincoln very wisely decided, no, we can't afford to fight both our own country and Great Britain at the same time. I believe his expression was, "One war is enough, gentlemen."
Yeah.
But he wisely got out of that. That's geopolitical circumstance number one. Geopolitical circumstance number two that most people forget about is that Tsar Alexander II
There we go. I was going to ask you about this.
Tsar Alexander II of Russia wrote in his memoirs and actually gave an interview to the Northern press after the war, where he was asked about, what was going on, and he very bluntly comes right out and says Russia was approached by Britain and France to recognize the government of the Confederacy. And his response was, I told them absolutely not. And the reason why, and he says, I wasn't doing this out of any great love for the American Republic, but had I done that, this would have basically split the country and allowed the British a monopoly and hegemony in the world that he did not want Russia to face. So what does he say? He says, that's why I sent my fleet
There we go, dude.
into San Francisco and New York Harbor as a demonstration of support for Mr. Lincoln. In other words, Russia saved our bacon. And by basically saying, okay, you want to recognize the Confederacy, then I'll recognize the Union, and we can turn this little scrap over there in that continent into a world war. Let's go for it.
Nobody knows that stuff. Nobody knows it at all. And it's so crazy to me because this weird hatred we have for Russia and
it's absurd.
Yeah, and based on your research, what do you think that stems from? We get into all this stuff, Khazarians, all this stuff, but
I will tell you exactly what I happen to be Russian Orthodox. Okay, that's my religion. So I'm Eastern Orthodox, and I can tell you that what it ultimately boils down to, this has been going on now for over a millennium. And what it is, the West hates the Orthodox culture. And the reason why is that culture is, number one, it's fully Catholic, but number two, it is not papal. And number three, therefore, it cannot be controlled by the West. That's why it hates it. If you look at the geopolitical business, if you look at the geopolitical interests of Russia and the United States, leave every cultural consideration out of view. There really are no major conflicts of interest between Russia and the United States. None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. The only thing that is involving us in this Russia hatred right now is the neocons that have control of the foreign policy of this government. And look at what they're doing. They've put a puppet government in charge of the Ukraine, and that government is doing what? Well, it's persecuting Orthodox Christians. That's what it's doing.
Yep.
So, and like it or not, folks, you're messing around with something the West does not understand, because Orthodox Christianity is not about pacifism. I can tell you that. The reason that Europe remained Christian was you had the Byzantine East Roman Empire resisting the Muslim incursions into Europe up until the 15th century. So the Muslim incursions into Europe had to go through Spain, okay, and it was stopped there too. So you have a long and involved history there that few Americans understand. Had it not been for Tsar Alexander II, it is very likely that the Western European powers, France and Britain, would have recognized the Confederacy. I doubt very much that Bismarck would have used that as anything else other than an opportunity, eventually to unify Germany, maybe a little earlier than actually happened. But I doubt very much that he would have been involved in a war like that. So you have all of this playing out in the background. And the other thing that we have to remember is that Tsar Alexander II was the other great emancipator of the 19th century, because he was the Tsar under whom the Russian serfs were given their freedom. And incidentally, when you look at the way that Russia handled the emancipation of its serfs under Tsar Alexander II, what the Russian government did was they set up this vast program of compensated manumission. They were going to compensate the slaveholders for the loss of their slaves and some of their land. And they were also going to provide low interest loans to the freed slaves to work the land that they were now owning. So in other words, it was a very thorough program, and it was very successful because it allowed Russia to then to get rid of the final vestiges of feudalism and jumpstart their own entrance into the industrial age. So, all of this is going on in Russia at the same time the United States is fighting its civil war. So there's a lot of geopolitical and cultural phenomenon in the mix that extends far beyond the borders of either the Union or the Confederacy.
So a lot of people, especially in our world of, I don't know if you like the term conspiracy, but what?
It's fine.
Yeah.
It's a term in law, so why should it be a term in history? Come on.
So that talk about how this whole thing is a spiritual war. We're in a spiritual war with dark entities and now you bring up Russian Orthodox. Now I want to see if there's any Russian Orthodox around where I live, because there's an Orthodox church near me that I want to go to, and I want to see if there's actually a Russian Orthodox based on
probably
what you're talking about. This is a spiritual war between dark entities and Christianity, and you bring up the Muslim incursions, and now we see Europe is just being flooded with a Muslim population. And we're told it's because we're bombing their area, which I think, their lands, which I know that we are. But this seems like it's being done on purpose. Like, it's like, okay, let's flood Europe with Muslims, so now we can get more into this Christian Muslim war and stuff like that. What are your whole thoughts on all that?
Oh, wow. Ultimately, I think what Mr. Globaloni and his fellow conspirators want to do is to replace the so-called Abrahamic monotheisms. I'm not comfortable with that term, but I'm simply using it as a term of convenience for everybody listening, okay? But I think their goal is to replace those monotheisms with something far more diabolical to hint at what they're up to, and with something that is completely, as a result of that diabolical agenda, completely materialist and man-centered. In other words, they're trying to bring in the golden age, but to do that, they've got to get rid of all that religion stuff.
And
so that's what I think they're up to. That's the long-term, and I mean really long-term goal. The short-term goal is, I think they have, pursued this policy in Europe, particularly to get rid of as much of the cultural baggage and implications or echoes and so on of Christianity as they can. And the other thing that is a part of that agenda is if you look at all of the churches, and I say all, you will find that all of them to some degree or another have been co-opted.
Yes.
From their, what I call their confessional orthodoxy. And what do I mean by that? Let's say you go to a Lutheran church. The sign outside says Lutheran. Okay. Now, whether or not it actually is Lutheran, you have to go into the church and find out what they do and what they really believe. Now, in this country, just because there's a sign that says Catholic or Lutheran or Orthodox or whatever, Presbyterian, whatever, are they following their traditional confessional doctrine? And as a part of that, are they following their traditional confessional tradition of worship? And the answer in 99% of the cases, particularly in the West and particularly in this country, is no, they're not. So the problem that people have is most people are not theologically literate, number one. So if you're an apostate clergyman, you can put basically anything over on your people, and they'll think, oh, this is what Lutheranism is, or this is what Episcopalianism. And I guarantee you that this is a phenomenon that has infected all of the churches, bar none, for very specific reasons that go back, I'd say, maybe 250 to about 300 years. So it's part of, you're watching the meltdown of the churches as part of a long-term plan. You first have to change the cultural institutions if you're going to change the West. And the institution number one that had to be changed the first and the most radically were the churches, and they began at Vatican with the Roman Catholic Church at Vatican II, and then from there it spread to Protestantism. And the same processes are, and for similar reasons, are underway in many Orthodox churches as well. They're just a little slower at it, and it's a little bit more difficult because those churches tend, by their very nature, they're Orthodox. So I mean, the name says it all. They tend to be very, very traditional, just culturally. All right. But the same thing is happening there.
If you had to say which one is closest to the truth, which one would you say?
Well, obviously Orthodoxy. I don't join churches that I think are not true. Okay. So in other words, the Orthodox Church does say very unequivocally that it is the true church, that it is the Catholic Church. The outfit in Rome, as far as we're concerned, becomes the first Protestant church, because as far as we're concerned, they split from us, not the other way around. So you are dealing, I tell people this, when you look at Eastern Orthodoxy, you have to forget everything that you think you know about Christianity, about Christian doctrine, and about Christian history. The Orthodox Church has been absolutely resolute in its opposition to the papal claims. Absolutely resolute. They are not part of the original deposit of the faith. Therefore, they are not genuinely and truly Catholic. And this is why a 19th century Russian Orthodox commentator, his name is Alexei Khomyakov, he said that the Pope is the first Protestant, and we mean it.
That's incredible. This is incredible. So I'm on my journey to find Christ. I have Christ in my heart. I'm learning. Again, I'm looking for churches to go to. Let
me give you a bit of advice.
Okay, I would love it. Thank you.
Don't be in a rush.
Okay.
You don't have to convert tomorrow. Okay. Take your time, and above all, read. And remember to read on your own, because you cannot, think of yourself as being in the same position as your average American citizen vis-a-vis the mainstream media. Can that media anymore be trusted? Answer, no. So you're in the same position vis-a-vis the churches. So the other thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to find sources that are not modern and older, so that you are ensuring that if you're reading, let's say if you're reading about Roman Catholicism, you're reading someone who's genuinely a Roman Catholic. Or if you're reading about the Church of England, you're reading somebody who's genuinely a traditional Anglican. Follow me?
Yes.
So in other words, you're searching for the confessionally Orthodox people that are unafraid and know how to articulate their specific denomination's traditional doctrine.
When you use
that's
that,
what you're looking
when you
for.
use that term confessionally, what are you talking about? Excuse me if that's a dumb question.
All right. Okay. If you look at, let's use the Lutherans again. All right. if you look at Lutheranism, it has certain confessions or doctrinal statements that it published shortly after the break with Rome. And eventually they gathered up all of these confessional statements in a book that in English was known as the Book of Concord, which would contain Luther's small and larger catechism, the Augsburg Confession, and sermons by Luther, statements, and so on. So in other words, there is a core set of doctrine, and there's a core set of ritual practice, and there's a core set of hymnography that is identifiably Lutheran, that if you are not following, you are Lutheran in name only. Lino. Like think of all of this as the ecclesiastical equivalent of Republican in name only. Follow me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so we've got Linos, we've got Einos, Episcopalian in name only, and Pinos, Presbyterian in name only, and Pinos, Catholic in name only, and Oinos, Orthodox in name only, and on we could go.
Right.
Because again, I go back to what I've said before. All of the churches are co-opted and infiltrated.
Yes.
Some more than others. Some are basically are so apostate that you're unable to recognize anything distinctly Christian about them. Okay, so there's also a continuum that you've got to look at. But I can assure you, the more you go back to the original sources. My doctorate is in patristics, the study of the church fathers. Okay. Now, that's a clue right there. It's not everybody in ancient times that is writing about Christianity. Not all of them are church fathers. Okay. But when you go back and study those people and what they wrote, that's where you find the formation of the core doctrines of Christianity taking shape. So you might want to read the primary sources. Okay. And you're soon going to discover when you do that there's a whoppingly huge difference between the way that most of those people think and then the one church father that sets up the way that the Western churches think. Now, I emphasize that because there is far more in common between your local Southern Baptist and your local Roman Catholic. They have far more in common with each other than they do with an Eastern Orthodox Christian. Why?
Interesting.
Because they think the same way. Follow me?
Yes.
Okay. So the West, please hear me now, folks. This is very important. The West, whether you are atheist, agnostic, Christian, Jewish, or what have you, the West tends to think of all of its theological questions in exactly the same way. The East doesn't. In the West, you will have a Baptist and a Roman Catholic talking about things like sin nature. The East won't say or ever use the term sin nature. Why? Because there are fundamental disagreements about what you inherit from Adam and Eve in the fall.
Okay.
In the East, you do not inherit sin, you inherit death. And if that's the fundamental problem, rather than sin, the fundamental fix is what? The resurrection. If, on the other hand, what you inherit is fundamentally something psychological and moral, it's like sin, then what's the cure? The cross. Follow me?
Yes.
So in other words, you're dealing with vast mentalities, huge mentalities that condition the way you look at theological questions and therefore the way you look at scripture and the way you interpret it. And I can guarantee you when I tell people, I have a friend that after years of trying to drill this into his head, he's finally getting it. And he's writing me say, oh, you're right. Everything, I have to unlearn everything that I thought I knew. in order to understand what this really is. And folks, you're not going to be able to understand Russia. You're not going to be able to understand Greece or Romania or the Ukraine or any of that. You're not going to be able to understand it if you're approaching it from the Western view. Why? Because it is the West that was kicked out of the Orthodox Church. So it's no longer genuinely, fully, and completely Catholic. Even Rome. Follow me?
Yes.
This is huge. I grant you that. I grant you that.
On your website, do you have any listing of books that people outside of your own books, which I'm going to buy a bunch of? Do you have lists of books where we can find all this stuff you're talking about? Because I'm going to go back.
You mean what I'm talking about now?
Yeah, like in terms of like you've listed a bunch of books.
Listen. The first books that I published were theological books, and I tell people, all of my books, every last one of them, including the theological books, are all interconnected. You're not going to understand the Giza Death Star stuff or any of that stuff without the theology books, and vice versa. So I have 4 books that are on my website in the books section. And the 4 books are called God, History, and Dialectic. It's one big book in 4 volumes. And the books are an attempt to show, particularly the second volume, is an attempt to show people that what happens in the West with Augustine of Hippo, the church father for the West is good old St. Augustine. Well, to cite a Protestant liberal theologian by the name of Paul Tillich, and I'm quoting him directly, Augustine is the foundation of everything the West has to say. Everything. And he is. But the problem is, the East doesn't think like Augustine, and for that matter, neither did the other Latin fathers. Okay? That's the other part of the problem here. The West starts to look at all that patristic testimony and witness through the lenses that St. Augustine put on them. So yeah, you get sin nature. Let me ask you another question. Or pardon me, the book is called God, History, and Dialectic. It's in 4 volumes, and it's on my website. And folks, it is difficult reading. It is graduate school, postgraduate school level of theology, because you're not going to be able to understand without learning and doing the work. There's no 2 ways about it.
All right.
But I do think that by the time you get to the second book, if you're really paying attention, you will see what begins to happen. Let me give you an example. Why is it the West repeatedly for the last 1,600 years repeatedly has debates about predestination and free will over and over and over and over? It occurred in the 4th and 5th century. It occurs again in the 9th century. It occurs again in the 13th and 14th century. It occurs during the Protestant and Catholic Reformation and Counter-Reformation, and on it has occurred since then. Why? Let me ask another question. Is there free choice in heaven?
What do you think, Johnny?
I think so, yeah. Because to me, choice is the ultimate value. If we can know anything about the Creator, it's that He values choice.
Okay,
they value choice.
Yeah. Can you sin in heaven?
No, I don't think there is I think anything that you would desire would be holy in heaven, as I understand.
Oh, the 72 versions.
Well, I'm not sure that there will be sex as a
Damn you, Johnny.
I just think you're going to be busy, dude. I don't know.
I don't know. That's why I had you answer it. I didn't want to get yelled at. Only kidding.
Yeah, but it's just not. I don't know. Heaven's not something I really think about much. It's because it's. I'm not sure there's much fruit there, like in considering what's going to happen.
You're digging, dude.
That raises another question. What are you going to do there?
Johnny's going to play harp.
Well, I imagine some like exploration or something. I don't know.
Well, okay,
Seems
you
boring.
guys are doing my theological Rorschach inkblot tests for me,
Yeah.
which is what I call them. You know, when I was a kid, I got to tell you this story because it kind of illustrates what I'm trying to get at. When I was a kid, I was raised in the old Methodist Episcopal Church back before they became United Methodist and completely went off off the rails. But I remember as a kid sitting in church and thinking, listening to the minister and his sermon and thinking, my word, heaven sounds terribly boring.
Yeah, totally. I remember thinking that way too.
Now, the question is why? Why do we think that in the West?
Because we hear about singing and choirs and, you know, permanent state of worship, and the worship that we do in the West is incredibly boring. So
that's very interesting. Let me ask another question. Might that have something to do with the way the West decorates or doesn't decorate its churches? And on we go. My point here is...
Wait up, to talk, the Catholic here, it was very sad. You go there and it's a very sad church. It's not happy. You see Jesus. It starts off when he's like holding the cross and then he's finally hung up. As a kid, it's very sad. You're like, why? What, this isn't a happy place
it's
to be
presented as
interesting. Almost... So in other words, you're saying that the iconography portrays a certain theological perspective.
Yes, that's what he's saying, not me.
Exactly.
Ding, ding, ding. I would totally agree with you. Okay. And this again is what I'm trying to get at. You're dealing with things that are so large we don't think about them until someone points out the obvious to us, and then you start thinking, is sin necessary, or the possibility of sinning necessary for there to be free choice? Where is the sin if I decide to go grocery shopping tomorrow rather than to fix my car? Now, those are two distinct choices. Well, there's neither one involves sin. So in other words, at what point in the West's way of thinking did free choice become a dialectical binary of choice between good and evil? By the way, hint, St. Augustine. Okay. Then on and on we go. On and on we go. These are huge, huge things that have affected our culture to the point that even those binary dualistic ways of thinking enter into the way we think about completely secular matters. Hard versus soft disciplines, science versus art. On and on we go. We've got everything in these neat categorical, dualistic. Where does that come from? Faith, not works. Scripture, not tradition. Free will, not predestination, or vice versa. Matter, spirit. Where is all that coming from? Well, in my opinion, it's coming directly as a result of the Augustinian theological inheritance of the Western religious mind. And this is why the West does not, cannot, and will not, and almost kind of stubbornly insists that it should not understand the Christianity of the East. That's the problem. So now we've got, we've got all this hullabaloo over the election of the latest pope. Why does the so-called West, with even the birthplace of the Protestant Reformation, pay any attention to the election of the Bishop of Rome? Why? Why the emphasis on central authority? And by the way, just to give you an illustration as to why theology is so very crucial and important, there's a secular version of it. Let's talk about the Roman Catholic idea of the indissoluble marriage. No divorces. If you want an annulment, that's a very different thing than a divorce, and you have to go to a special court all the way in Rome to get a marriage annulled. Henry VIII ran into this little problem. Really? Remember? And the court determines if the marriage has ever really been a legal sacramental marriage. In other words, you were living a fiction for all those years. Now look at the view of the union promulgated by Abraham Lincoln. What is it? Well, it's a secular version of a Roman Catholic marriage. Once in, you can never get out, no matter how beastly the circumstances become. So in other words, you just got to grin and bear it. It's a suicide pact. If California takes over the rest of the country, God forbid.
God forbid.
God forbid. We're stuck on Mr. Lincoln's view. It's an indissoluble union. So there's your secular version of it. Are there no circumstances under which marriages can and should be dissolved? Really? In this fallen world? So are we stuck with a union in this fallen world forever? This is the problem. So in other words, my point here is that these topics are rooted, like it or not, they are rooted in a metaphysical view of the world. They're rooted in a cosmological view of the world. They're rooted in a theological view of the world. And we're not going to solve it by electing Donald Trump or Kamala Harris and ignoring the roots of the causes. That's the problem.
And in the root of the cause is that we've gone away from God in your.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But please note, for me, I don't think God in general. Let me quote St. Gregory, the theologian, a 4th century church father, who said, when I say God, I mean Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, period. Not the God in general. So the next question is, when did the God in general become the God of the West? And why? Follow me?
Yes. It seems like there's been a concerted effort to separate everybody from God. And it seems like it's been done, I'm in recovery. They always say a God of your choice. And I understand that into the sense of trying to get people who are broken and hurt, but also have a negative view of God through all of these scandals and all that stuff. And what was happened over time is they want you to attribute the actions of man to God. These guys represent God. They are God. And look at what they've done with kids and all that stuff. And that detaches you from God. And that's been done forever. Same thing they did in politics. Same thing they did in entertainment. They position wicked people that they know are going to fall, and then everyone will start to become disenfranchised with that power structure. And they've done that on purpose. And a lot of people can't understand that. They can't understand that, like, the actions of man is not the action of God. And they can't detach from that. That man has fallen. That person has fallen. That teacher that hooks up with their student, that person has fallen. That is not God. Why would God let this happen? Why would God let that happen?
Most of our problems in this country is that we think that the good and the perfect are the same. But in this world, you will never have perfection. Period. You will have goodness, and it's always going to come mixed in with some degree of imperfection. Again, to me, the classic case are the two presidents during the Civil War, Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln. Neither one of these men were bad men. They were both very principled men. Were some of their principles objectionable to us today? Absolutely. Absolutely. But they were not for that reason wicked. And therefore they are not for that reason to be ignored in our own understanding and comprehension and confrontation with our own history. When you remove history, you are removing the ability to see what is genuinely good and evil. And that's why we have galloping, rampaging evil masquerading as perfection in this country right now. It's the oldest trick in the book. You know, I don't care if Abraham Lincoln made some racist remarks about black people during his run for the presidency, during the presidency, and after. The fact of the matter remains that he was willing to act upon those principles that he thought were good and necessary for the country vis-a-vis black people and their emancipation. That's the fact.
There's an old
That's
saying
the fact.
there was a saying by Thomas Sowell that basically, like, in a world that demands perfection, only liars can get through.
Yep, that's correct. That's correct.
So, and I don't want to talk about anything that makes you uncomfortable, but, you know, when you look at Putin and the Ukraine, both Zelensky and Putin are Jewish, and there's a discussion that a part of
Putin is actually a baptized, practicing member of the Russian Orthodox Church.
But I was told he had Jewish ancestry.
I don't care.
Okay.
I don't care.
But just let me ask this question, and I'm fine if I'm wrong. But is there some sort of ethnic cleansing of white Christians in the Ukraine through this war?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Zelensky, I'll tell you what's going on. Zelensky, you have to understand, he represents a literal neo-Nazi segment in Ukrainian politics. It goes back to World War II and prior, to a fellow by the name of Stefan Bandera. All right. So that's problem number one. And I'm not saying that there are not things in history that the Ukrainian people are justifiably afraid of the Russians for. Think only what the communists did in the Ukraine under the collectivization. And by the way, the man that was the enforcer for the recollectivization, in other words, the re-ensurfing, quite literally, of all those Ukrainian farmers that had been given their freedom under the czars. The man that was the enforcer for the communist government was known as the Butcher of Kiev. Guess who it was?
Who was it?
Nikita Khrushchev, the Butcher of Kiev. That was his nickname. That's how he rose to prominence in the communist hierarchy, was enforcing those collectivization decrees. So there are historical causes for the Ukrainians to be upset and wary of Russia. And for that matter, we can push it all the way back to the period of time immediately prior to World War I and so on, to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and on it goes. However, the Zelensky government, and this is where the ecclesiastical geopolitics becomes so absurdly convoluted, because Zelensky removed the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from the jurisdiction of the Patriarchate of Moscow, which, number one, he has no authority to do.
Right.
But it's at least understandable given the history of the modern Russian church. He then, this is where the ecclesiastical politics comes in and the murky part. He then took that church and went to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, the so-called ecumenical patriarch, or as I like to call it, the ecumeniacal patriarchate, and went to the Patriarchate of Constantinople to get a tomos, or a decree, of autocephaly from the Patriarchate, which means self-governance, okay? Now, if you know anything about the Orthodox Church, you will know that the ecumenical patriarchate is not the head of the Orthodox Church. He's not the Orthodox equivalent of the Pope. However, in the recent 150-year history of the Orthodox Church, he's sounding increasingly like the Pope. And of course, the other Orthodox bishops and patriarchates are objecting to that. And on top of this, the ecumenical patriarchate is supported with lots of money from, here it comes, folks, Great Britain,
Yeah.
the United States, and the Vatican.
There we go.
There we go.
The three pillars.
The three pillars. So in other words, what's going on in the Ukraine right now, vis-a-vis the church and culture aspects of it, are deeply embedded and involved in geopolitics and in ecclesiastical politics. Most people don't even have a clue about. And I point out the ecumenical patriarchate as my primary example of why I tell everybody that the same process of co-option and infiltration is underway in the Orthodox Church, just like everywhere else. It's just taking a little longer to bring about. But that's my case, that this is the same process at work. And, I have nothing to do with the ecumenical patriarchate, because as far as I'm concerned, it's beginning to look very unorthodox. And again, it's not the name, it's the content of belief. And I can assure you the content of belief of the Orthodox Catholic and Apostolic Church is that there is no infallible Pope figure running everything, because you don't need one. Okay.
Decentralized. So I have a friend of mine, deep Christian, talks to me about prophecy. I don't know if it's biblical prophecy, but prophecy. He talks about how there's going to be a war between the pagans and the lost tribes, which is Britain, UK, and just Israel and the United States, and the leader of the pagans, which is now known as Germany. And I'm willing to take
all of the Protestant Reformation, by the way.
Okay, so do you see any of this as why Germany is constantly being annihilated, either through war or culturally? Like, if you look at Germany right now, culturally, it's like, seems like it's so lost. It's like there's just all,
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
What the Nazis' role and all that is.
Well, look, German culture, just like every other peculiar national and ethnic culture in the West, is under assault from Mr. Globaloney. There's no doubt about that. Germany, as a nation, we have to remember, has had a very stormy history, because it's only been unified 3 times in its entire history. The first example being the Holy Roman Empire, basically the empire that was the heir to Charlemagne. And then the second empire, the German reunification under Bismarck in the 19th century. And then more recently with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany. There essentially been those 3 reunifications. The problem of Germany is that it is in a totally unenviable geopolitical position. It is literally surrounded on all sides by powerful countries: France, Britain, Italy, Russia, and at one time in its history, Austria-Hungary. So, the problem with Germany is that it has had, simply by the nature of the case, always to have a strong and powerful military just to defend itself. And as a result of having that military, the other thing the German, that is just part of the German way of war, I mean, it's been this way for several centuries. They have had to take that military and train it to move very quickly and to hit very hard and way above its, punching way above its weight class, so to speak. So that, that's just always going to be Germany, like it or not. Now, we tried after the end of World War I to tell Germany, no, you can't have that big military anymore. Well, that didn't work out. That didn't work out too well. So they decided that, yeah, we're going to have a big military, and it's going to be really big. So and very punchy. So the Nazis were just kind of the ones to benefit from that geopolitical circumstance and that particular part of German culture. So I'm not worried about Germany per se. I really am not. I would be more worried if the European Union or NATO weren't there. Then, yeah, I'd be more worried about Germany because, again, they're going to have to rearm. You know, the United States is a failing empire, like it or not. And that means that all those old rivalries and powers in Europe are going to have to rearm. And principal power number one in Europe is guess who? You know, it's just like Japan. Japan's going to have to rearm. And by the way, that's what they're doing. Okay.
I get that.
Yeah, I get that too. I don't begrudge them that, you know.
Is there a hidden hand in the rise of Hitler, in your opinion?
Oh, yes, absolutely there is. But to get back to your, you know, I'm going around Harvey's barn again. To get back to your other question about biblical prophecy, I have to warn people that I suspect very strongly that Mr. Globaloney is using people's understandings, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, and interpretations of biblical prophecy as a template of their own geopolitical action. And that therefore, I want to warn people, the fulfillment is the deception. And we're seeing it particularly now with all the stuff going on about Israel, and we're hearing it every day on talk radio in this country of, oh, I will bless them that bless thee and curse them that curse thee, and therefore we all have to support Israel.
Yes.
Folks, I'm going to be very blunt and honest. That view is a denial of Christ.
Oh.
And the reason why is it has always been the understanding of the church that that particular verse applies to Christ, who is the fulfillment of the law and of all of its sacrifice and of all of its covenants, and therefore whose church, whose body is Israel. So the blessings and cursings accrue to those who bless Christ and the church, not that little thing over in the Middle East.
Damn.
Yes.
The fulfillment of prophecy that people are expecting is the false fulfillment. It is a preparation for you know who. There is only one thing that false fulfillment cannot reduplicate. It cannot conquer death. My kingdom is not of this world is for a reason, and that reason has to do with the resurrection. It has nothing to do. That's the rebuilt temple. It has nothing to do with a pile of bricks over in the Middle East anymore. That's the problem that we're witnessing right now. And everybody's on that bandwagon, including the Muslims expecting the Imam Mahdi and that sect of Judaism that is doing all this because they want to bring about the Messiah. So you have all of these groups working to fulfill their prophecy when in fact they're all ignoring the fulfillment that's already there. Okay, I can't be more blunt and simple, folks. And I don't care how many Bible verses you throw at me. The problem is you're interpreting those verses with the wrong pair of spectacles to begin with. So I'm not interested unless you can point me to the course of performance in an ecumenical council of the church or in a father of the church acknowledged as an authority that's your interpretation of where it comes from. I'm not interested. Sola scriptura doesn't work, folks. There is in law what is called the course of performance. When you are in doubt over the interpretation of an ambiguous contract, the law will have you look at the course of performance of the people that are subscribing to that contract and how that course of performance suggests that the contract should be interpreted. This is not to be done in a vacuum. Christ did establish apostles who had doctrinal authority in the church, and they handed that down. So there is a tradition of interpretation that you also have to look at. Your Bible and Bible only is not going to work. And by the way, there's a little example of the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts that is there to illustrate precisely that point. So on and on we could go. But beware of these fulfillments of biblical prophecy, because what they are ultimately teaching you to do is look away from Christ as the fulfillment.
Yeah, I agree. Sir, it's been an honor. I know we have a time crunch, so I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. I have your book on the Babylonian bankers. I would love if you could come back sometime. We can get into that.
Sure.
One more time, where would you like them to go find you?
If they're interested in finding me, they need to go to my website. It's www.gizadeathstar. That's all one word, GIZADEATHSTAR.com. That's where they can find me. And if they need to email me, that's where they can find the contact button to do so.
Well, it's been an honor, man. We've done a lot of shows, and this one stands out as one of my favorites. It was a blessing that you came and spent some time with us.
Well, thanks for having me, guys.
Anytime, all the time. We appreciate you coming on, and let's break down this episode. Wow. Fire, dude.
Yeah.
We usually take a couple minutes before we get into it, but we had to jump right into it, man. That guy is a plethora of knowledge. Every time I think I'm somewhat smart, I talk to someone like him, and I'm going, oh, I'm dumb.
What are you going to do with this book?
Read it.
Didn't you see? He said it's very dense. What do you call it, Johnny?
What do you mean?
He talked about his book, about how it was very...
Well, dense. You said dense.
Or
That's a good
for
word
like
for it.
scholarly.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
like
it's 4-part book, he said,
like an
on just
academic
basically
thing,
the
yeah.
church.
Yeah.
I mean, dude, it's everything he says lines up.
Yeah, it's funny. The one thing as my Protestant bones kind of
And that's okay. You don't have to agree with everything, Johnny.
when he starts talking about how, because to me, the mistake of both the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church is all the liturgy and all the tradition that was established by people. You know, all that shit that's caked on top of that what Jesus said.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I get what you're saying.
I doubt all of that. Even if it did come from the Pauline from Paul.
You're talking about like I don't know if this is part of it, but like confession, like all that.
That's
stuff.
among the things. Yeah.
Do you think eating of the blood of Christ and all that stuff?
I think it's possible. I mean, I grew up doing that rarely on like, high holidays, but it was but we didn't, as Protestants didn't believe it literally. No, but I think all that's extraneous and not that important. And at worst, it's wrong, possibly, because it's, how do you, you know what I mean? Like, it's established by a line of popes and look at who the pope is. All our popes lately have sucked.
Yeah.
And what? They're the ones creating all these traditions and stuff.
I agree.
And there have been popes even they had popes, before the split for the Orthodox, there were popes that established traditions that they continue. So I don't know.
I mean, because the Catholic one is you gotta do your communion first, and that's when you're allowed to start to talk to the priest to tell him your confessions, and then after you confess all your sins is when he's allowed to
molest your children. Oh no,
that's after.
Yeah.
And then he's allowed to give you the right to eat and drink the body of Christ, and then you go, and then he tells you to give a couple prayers. So you can
seems like that's excessive, right?
Yeah,
it just seems like what. So he's talking about a lot about sins. Do you guys feel like that he felt like we get too lost in the sin?
Yes.
I wanted to ask him those things, but I know we had a short amount of time, so I didn't want to get lost into that stuff. And maybe if we have him back, I can ask him that. Because, there's a lot of stuff about, and listen, my whole thing about religion right now and my own spiritual journey is like, I want it how it applies to me and how I work through that, and not this desire to push it on other people.
Yes.
And not have people in my life that maybe don't subscribe to that way of thinking. And I just feel like that's just for me. I need to make decisions on how I act and how I treat people and how I and all that stuff. Do you understand? Like,
no, totally. It's the split among Protestants. There's the split between the evangelicals and the rest. And the evangelicals are the ones that are very much about imposing and going out and trying to convert everybody you come across. And then there are people for whom faith is more personal. But I mean, if you thought that, as many evangelicals, most, probably all of them do, with a few exceptions, I'm sure, that not telling people about that meant their eternal damnation, then I guess I would be out there in the streets too. I feel like I'm in my opinion that God finds people where they are. But yeah, I mean, that's a tough.
But also imagine you not converting people doesn't let you in.
Yeah, that's not. I mean, that's not even the evangelical.
What
faith.
I find so interesting is like things he said we've talked about in the show before. And not that doesn't mean it's not interesting, because it is super interesting, but it reinforces things that we believe that we see playing out in real time, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Like the influx of Muslims into Europe. That is done on purpose to destroy Christianity.
You're right.
No, I mean, I'm fighting this thing still. But that all lines up to me. That is all interesting to me. That is done purposefully by what I believe in. He has a book. I have it at home. The Babylonian bankers.
What's their end game?
To destroy our connection with God. Like, they most likely worship fallen angels, the Watchers. And that clicks. When you start talking about that stuff, you're like, yeah, everything lines up perfectly. And you get into so much, like, you get into, like, how, when he goes, all these churches are corrupt. I get that, man. I get that. When Ted Cruz is going, those who bless Israel are blessed, those who curse Israel are cursed, and he believes it's a country, that's all manipulation. That at some point we're going to call this area Israel because we're going to tell them if they don't bless Israel, they are cursed. It's such a deep chess game.
Well, he got punked by Tucker, didn't he? I mean, just exposed him because he he didn't say come out with that. Tucker really had to dig to get him to kind of finally just spill it that, like, hey, I'm here because this is. Like, so I'm brainwashed by this prophecy, basically, and that's the only thing you could tell when he got to that.
And that brainwashing allows him to do what he wants to do, which is collect money from people and be in this power position.
AIPAC, no big deal.
This allows me to line up. I'm taking this money from people that are killing children, okay? And I'm doing it because I'm a Christian, and this view lines up, allows me to do this without feeling like I'm committing violence against God's people who are everybody.
Everybody. That's what Jesus came to say. Yeah, Jew and Gentile alike, are capable of salvation, and not, because that's a very different thing, and we know it because the tradition of Judaism continues.
And you got these people out there that are talking about how Jesus isn't real and all that stuff, and it's like, there is so much at work, right?
Yeah.
To discredit God, that why would they go through something like that that's so fake? If it's so fake and made up and it's like based on Caesar and all this stuff that you hear a lot of people talk about, why would they go through so much to destroy that brand? Right?
Yeah.
Like if it's really a manipulation,
that's a good point. Yeah.
Wouldn't they encourage it like they do with elections? Right? Like if we go, elections don't matter, and they're constantly pushing it, well, because it's a false paradigm. And maybe at some point it was real. right? It keeps people engaged. At some point, it was real. And at some point, they came in and completely manipulated it. And it gets people into this right-left paradigm that isn't real.
Yeah.
And that's how it is, dude. Look at how they talk about Christ. Look at how they talk about elections.
And that's just bad history. The thing that Jesus, because a lot of people try to say he didn't even exist, which is the most cynical of all the historians about Jesus say that he existed at the very least. I mean, it's just bad history. It's just you want to believe that. It's a belief at that point, really.
Well, it could also get into that these people out there, I'm not going to say names because I'm just not interested in that, but that are like, this is a fake thing. It's like, well, maybe the presentation of how he's being presented.
That's what worries me about the church, the liturgy and all the traditions and stuff. Like because we know, I mean, we've got a pretty good, every time they find an older scripture, it's always shocking how accurate it is compared to what we have now. Like, or what we, the older copies we had. Because there was a long time where we were like, boy, this has been hundreds and hundreds of years after the fact that these copies of the New Testament were written, or the Old Testament, and then they just keep getting pushed back, and they're always just like really remarkably consistent across the generations,
And what he said about what they're doing in Israel fits into what Seven Seas just put out, that they're astroturfing the fulfillment of these prophecies to get everybody behind it.
Yes, yeah.
And my God, did that guy drop some hammers on the Civil War?
Yes.
And how much deeper it was? And did you know that they had troops in Canada? Did you know that? Maybe I'm an idiot. You did know that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a nerd about
He
Civil
goes
War.
deep down on the
But
Civil
you
War,
knew that like Napoleon set up for a puppet government?
Oh, dude, well, it's funny. The guy that he installed, what was his name? Maximilian, maybe? He actually was a great leader. He ended up getting killed, but he did a lot of really liberalization of the country, modernized Mexico's government, and then they just, he's out. I think they shot him in the end because he was a puppet figure, and they wanted to be ruled by a native, but it was
now they're ruled by a Jewish woman.
Yeah.
It's so crazy. But the
I tried to
confirmation.
explain that to my dad. And then she's like, well, she's still Catholic. I'm like, even if she's still Catholic, just her being Jewish and there being, 10,000 of them in all of Mexico doesn't surprise you?
Yeah, and then to get her election, they assassinated everybody else. Yeah. People just moved on from that. Like 26 people were assassinated. That's
crazy.
Isn't that crazy?
It's like candidates all across the country, to be fair. But yeah, that's like, well, did you guys see whatever happened to that guy in Colombia a couple of weeks ago? Is he all right?
He survived. Unbelievable.
I cannot believe that.
Because that was a straight headshot.
And I've never seen so much blood. It was horrifying.
And you have to be like, imagine if you're an assassin. It's like, I hit him in the head. What do you mean he's still alive?
I'm thinking maybe JFK did fake his death, and he's out there with the hole in his head.
Well, that whole thing's interesting. But
by survived as in like on the deathbed? Is he brain dead? Is he like 50 Cent?
Nobody said that he's brain dead. I didn't hear that. He's in the hospital recovering. But then, they're like, we got to still take him out. So they're probably sending people over there now.
Let's see. Man, there's not a lot of updates on that. He's undergo shooting. That was 2 weeks ago. He had his security detail cut on the day of the attack.
When you get that call, when you're like, hey, where's security? Yeah, they got cut. All right, speech is done. Yeah. I'm going home.
Going home. It's over, dude. I'm not running for president anymore. Sorry. That's dark. Hold on. I'm trying to, what was the guy's name?
Man, we got
Maximilian the First of Mexico. Yeah, his name was, he was Habsburg. And they were trying to restore the monarchy there. And then, he was executed by firing squad in 1867. Juarez had him shot.
Crazy.
But he did a lot of stuff. Yeah, like good stuff. Napoleon III is kind of famously a dipshit, though. Like, he wanted to, and he's not even like the direct descendant of Napoleon, I don't think. I think he's like his nephew or something. See, I'd always heard that what was interesting about that to me, I'd always heard that France wanted to support the Confederacy more directly, but it was England that kind of helped them back. Russia didn't want to, but if England had given the go-ahead, France would have engaged, but it was always England was kind of had the final say over that. So that's interesting for him to say that it was actually the French and the British that wanted it, but it was the Russians that slowed him down. That's fascinating to me. I didn't know that.
It is fascinating. And then he gets into, England, the United States, and the Vatican, which we talk about those three pillars that are basically control the world. And the fact that he brought, Alexander, again, gets into this whole thing about Russia and just like this demonization of Russia and what they've done to those people. And it does make sense when you start to look into the spiritual war that's really about the Russian Orthodox Church that they cannot control. And this deep hatred of it, and why they hate Russia, but they love China, which is completely and utterly like atheist, right? The communism is the absence of God.
The state is God, the leader is God,
Which is, again, you're getting into this Muslim in New York City who wants to make all these supermarkets government ran. That's the beginning of socialism. That's the and that is the beginning of communism.
This is the place where you'll queue up in like 10 years to get bread from the government. That's what he's establishing, basically.
Yeah, because
it's ridiculous.
An independent store cannot compete with the government.
No, we learned it from like the postal service, right? They suck compared to now. They were improved because they did have to compete with FedEx and UPS, but they suck.
But you can also get into like. If something is ran by the government, does it need to make a profit? The Federal Reserve runs at the U.S. Postal Service runs in the red all the time. So if you have these supermarkets,
like a government Walmart, you're talking like government Walmart,
a government Vons or Ralph's, that's what we have in L.A. Ralph's. It's the big grocery store.
It's like the Kroger
Imagine if that was ran by the California. They don't have to run at a profit. So they can offer you way cheaper goods because the other businesses have to run at a profit to stay open. It's the worst idea. And this guy's going around to all these influencers going, we're only raising taxes on the 1%. I don't give a fuck how much money you make. A tax is a penalty. A tax is a penalty. It is hurting you for succeeding. And what do they give you when you fail? They reward you with welfare. It's a reward for failing.
Yeah.
And these people are like, I can't make it money. Here's some money. Congratulations. You don't have to work for it. We're just going to give it to you.
But I agree. All that. But eventually, isn't the UBI going to be that?
That's what they want. I don't know. I think they would. I think it's going to be a slower run. I am very worried about this thing that RFK Jr. wants us to wear. Have you seen this? Like, it's like a. Will you look up this? Like RFK trackable. It's something he just put out.
What is it for? Like tracking fitness, like stuff?
Yeah, and all that
here
stuff.
It is. Okay. RFK Jr.'s bonkers plan to fit every American with a tracking device. As he
we already have tracking devices called our phone.
Yeah, truly.
But this is the beginning of putting stuff on you that is going to lead to more social credit. He
says that Apple Watch, Fitbit, Whoop, Oura Ring were key to the Maha agenda. He said that technology could help people lose weight and exercise more regularly, which I agree with that. But is he talking about something on your chest? Well, I didn't see that.
What I can picture is you use your phone, you walk around, and they won't give you your medicine if you don't get your 20,000 steps because you're not participating. You get what I mean?
Yeah,
you don't get the discount.
Insurers are already trying that with they're giving you discounts on insurance if you agree to like have your steps tracked and stuff like that. They caught Tesla with car insurance. I don't know if they caught them. It was a feature, really. But people found that when they were speeding and driving more recklessly, their Tesla car insurance got more expensive because Tesla was using their data.
Social credit score.
Yeah.
So now what they want to do is they're going to start using your phones. Basically, when you use a GPS app, like let's say Waze, and they go, oh, this is a super busy highway. How they know that? Based on how many cell phones are there. So now what they're going to start doing is based on how fast your cell phone's going, they're going to send you a ticket. Does anybody want that?
People would riot, dude. They're not gonna. You think
Dude,
maybe in California?
Well, I mean, we did get away with traffic cams, so maybe there is something to that, Johnny.
I mean, that's infinitely
What about
worse
that?
than traffic cams.
What about the one me and John were talking about? Your insurance can keep track of your steps. You hit 20,000 steps, you get discounted insurance on
They
your
already
house.
do that. They already do that.
Yeah, but dude, what
I know, it
happens?
sounds scary. No,
what
I
happens
trust
if
it, yeah.
you don't get 20,000 steps?
That's
what
the problem,
happens?
yeah.
To you?
I'm okay when I'm giving discounts or something, but as long as they're not cloaking the
And
the
how
discount is
don't
actually the
they
base
do
rate.
that? If you're just a fat fuck that never gets off the couch and you want to get insurance,
You're gonna get dinged.
Oh, that's
you're right,
the old
you're right.
days. Yeah,
You're gonna get dinged.
you said you'd not be able to afford it or you didn't get it. Yeah,
yeah.
but that's what Obamacare did, made it so that people like that could. Now everybody has expensive insurance, but most people can afford it. You know what I mean? But it's enough to hurt.
That was
everybody.
an all-time banger.
Absolutely.
That was an all-time banger, dude. We've had some great episodes lately.
Got to have him back soon.
I'd have him on every day. You want to be the co-host? Go
We
to
we got one more spot on the couch.
Go to samtripoli.com. You can grab all my dates. Can't wait to get to San Diego, July 17th through the 19th. August, I'm going to be in Boston, Broadbrook with Eddie Bravo whenever this pussy decides to fly. Kansas City, next one. And then, let's go up one. Oh, that's Kansas City. Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and Skankfest. More dates coming. Constantly trying to get booked everywhere, so we do it. Dude, the premium content, Sam Tripoli, has been fire, I must say. SamTripoli.com. I mean, everything is deep dives, dude. Deep dives. Now, you get 3 episodes a week on SamTripoli.com. I also put it on Twitter. I also put it on Locals. I also put it on Substack. And I also put, and when I say put 1 episode a week on Substack, Twitter, and Rockfin gets 2 because it's $15, and Sam Tripoli gets 3. So you can go, depending on what you want to do, but the bangers of bangers are on samtripoli.com, and I'm constantly putting there. It's more of up-to-date stuff that's going on. You know, we booked Tinfoil Hat out. I think we're booked out till October right now. So these are pre-booked people, and we tend to keep it more evergreen, meaning today's episode, you could watch that a year from now, 2 years from now, six years from now. We're debating whether we're gonna bring back TFH live. I think we might do it half an hour on Friday live on our new YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/tinfoilhat YouTube. Check that out. We're doing it ourselves. Yes, it is. It's going to be YouTube friendly. That's the only way you can survive on there. But I'm seeing all these people getting hundreds of thousands of views on their thing, and they're doing what we're doing. You know, so we got to kind of play in that. That's where the main street is, guys. That's where they all go. If you go down a little bit.
Can I just also say, I saw someone complaining to me on Twitter that we were censoring the show now. You outed yourself as someone who only watches on YouTube if you're complaining about that, because it's not censored anywhere else. They thought we were just...
Twitter, you get the full thing. Sam Tripoli, you get the full thing. Rockfin, you get the full thing.
Don't watch on the that's ruled by the most evil company on the planet.
Rumble, you get the full thing. Substack, you get the full thing. Aussie, you get the full thing. You get it all over the place. BitChute, you get the full thing. YouTube, for some reason, is the only place most people want to go. That's where it is. And we'd be real idiots not to play by their rules to put our thing up. We have to do it. It's where all the views are. And if you don't like the censored, go to the plethora of other platforms that want the show in its real form. If you really, Johnny, let me tell you something, guys. I always tell you about Cash Daddies, the Patreon. Johnny, really great weekend for a couple of our stocks, right?
Yes. NVIDIA and Uber.
Uber went nuts today, yesterday. NVIDIA going nuts. So, I mean, you would know all this if you checked out Cash Daddies. Patreon.com/Cash Daddies. You go there, it's $20 a month. That's so much money. If you listen and you play it right, And again, you could lose at any time because it is a form. I wouldn't say it's gambling, but it really is, right? You're
investing in your future.
You're investing in your future. You'd make $20 out the gate. Go to patreon.com/SamDaddy. Go Cash Daddies. Howie Dewey is crushing it. Dates. Chaos Twin saw. I was blessed to see the Paranoid American this weekend. He says it's looking really good. Episode 2. Go down. And then, guys, these are the affiliates.